Guys, we have a content-packed episode coming to y'all today. Jeff and I had the opportunity to speak at the Gasworld European CO2 Summit about a month and a half ago. This was a little unorthodox to what we do for a typical podcast. Jeff and I actually prepared some material and came in to discuss what we think the future of CO2 looks like, specifically in Europe and also back in North America.
Yeah, it's a broad overview of both the U.S. and European markets. We cover a lot of high-level topics, getting into some detail and a lot of different facts, figures, and talking points. So watch the video along with it. We pulled the slides up that kind of cover the talking points. I think it adds a lot of value. I got to say, I went back and re-listened to it over the weekend, and that is probably my favorite episode that we've done.
I have to agree, and rather than getting kind of blinded by Jeff's bald head, you get some really good content that we prepared, laid out in the slides.
That's fair.
So I think you're going to be more engaged, but I agree, Jeff, one of my favorite episodes as well. You guys are in for a treat. Thank you all. Thank you, Gasworld, for having us watch and enjoy.
This is just a conversation. Like I said, this is we are taping a live taping of the podcast. We kind of set out, we said, let's have a few questions. Originally, actually, we were going to have a debate on the stage of sequestration versus utilization and get parties from different aspects of those arguments and really kind of hammer on the sequestration people because we believe more in utilization than sequestration. But that didn't really come together. We said, let's just have a conversation and really open up the conversations for later on, for everybody outside here. We're not going to tell you anything new today. It's really talking about the market and the industry as a whole. So we've got 3 questions we prepared. There's no presentation. We have just various little slides of some things if we have some talking points, facts, and figures that we want to point to. But we didn't prepare ahead of time between each other. We might disagree on certain things. We might say things that make absolutely no sense, and people in the audience feel like, you're making that up, and that's probably fair and true. So that will absolutely happen. No, so we're just going to kind of open it up and go through these questions, and we'll bounce back and forth here. I think it's important to note, we've talked a lot about today, especially in that last group, in the last 2 groups, about biomethanes and e-fuels and utilization, and that's so important because we talk about how important that is and that nobody's saying it. We like to say that the U in CCUS is silent because outside of this room and outside of this forum, it's all about sequestration. It is all about direct air capture. All the news goes there, all the money goes there, all the funding and investment goes there. But we don't talk enough about utilization. We don't talk enough about all the e-fuels and the biomethanes and things like that, and what's going to really, really move the needle. Because personally, this is Jeff Holyoke speaking. I don't believe that sequestration is the long-term answer. We can't just constantly be producing it, hoping it stops coming along the way, hoping that we get off of fossil fuels in the next 8 years, 7 years, and then all of a sudden we're not going to produce CO2. We will always produce some level of CO2. We're going to minimize that, mitigate that, and shrink that, but we will always produce it. So we need to be talking more about utilization. So our first question was sequestration versus utilization.
So, yeah, I think what's really important to understand is that there are competing interests, and we've talked about it a little bit today, but Jeff hit it on the head. Outside of this room, there are larger voices, and we're very niche. So majority of us fall into right here, existing CO2 utilization. We're here because we're a distributor, or we utilize the CO2, we sell applications of CO2, but there are 3 other groups that are very important whose voices are not recognized here. And so that's going to be emerging climate technology, emerging CO2 utilization, some of the new things we're talking about, polymers and plastics, and European Commission 2040 target, so all of the regulations that are being rolled out. And amongst the 4 of these groups, we all have to come to alignment, and we all have the mutual need for CO2. And so we'll probably focus a little bit today on emerging climate tech, because as I noted, when we have our conversations, it's a lot of that. We get the phone calls, hey, we're looking to invest in direct air capture. We have a new technology. We bring people on the podcast that are trying out hundreds of different DAC technologies. And this is where the media coverage grows. One of our partners, Heirloom, they just signed a big deal with Microsoft, and their founder was on How I Built This. That's a huge national podcast, global podcast. That is where the buzz is going. But does it accomplish what we need here in this room? And how do we bring that conversation to that group as well, and not just here? And then ultimately, the European Commission, they're going to drive everything. Where does the investment go? Where are the dollars going? We're seeing it in the US. That's why we talk about direct air capture, because we've incentivized direct air capture through 45Q and the IRA bill that came out. And I believe that that is going to be the drive. We have to all come together and align.
Yeah, I think Stephen hit it on the head earlier about 200 euros per CO2 for commercial markets, and that's that's a very high price. It's not sustainable if we want to have e-fuels, all these things. But then you talk about direct air capture. We work with a lot of the direct air capture pilot programs, and none of them are anywhere remotely close to less than $500. Sorry, we're Americans, so I'll translate that. What is that? 420 euros. No, I don't know. I'm not going to do the math, but yeah. But
No public math.
$500
No
a
public
ton
math.
to
Don't do it.
sequester is a good number. At the best case, they might get down to $300 a ton to sequester the CO2. So it's hard to say. That's where we're putting all the money. Somebody's paying for that, right? It's being invested. And it's in, you talked about the heirloom in the model there, Microsoft who's the Swipes, Stripe.
Stripe.
Yeah, they're investing
Shopify.
tons of money and investment dollars into these carbon credits. And I think they're buying the carbon credit market to be able to sell them later because nobody else will have that many credits. But where's that money coming from? It's tax dollars that are going to that. So we're spending it anyway. It's just, are we spending it over here? It doesn't seem like it is here. But the cost of all our goods are going to go up for all of these purposes. And so where do we go with that? And so that's how it is. It's the competing interests. So, but to me, I'm going to jump over yours really quick to get to this one. I like this grab. I think it's a really. I wish they'd make it less children-like, but this is basically.
It's actually really good for you, Jeff. I'm going to say.
I'm all about fifth grade level. That's about as far as you're going to get from us today. But this is really this comes from Speed and Scale, from John Doerr's whole methodology. The IAE has adopted most of this as well. But this is the 50 by 2050. We have to eliminate 50 gigatons of CO2 emissions, as well as capture some of that. And so, this slide kind of shows that these are the full bar is where we are today. By 2050, we have to get down here to all these different things. And I always kind of look at that and I say, in the news and everything we talk about electric vehicles and maybe a little bit about hydrogen or something like that. But all the conversations about electrified transportation, well, that's not the biggest impact. The biggest impact, the hard to abate industries are our power grid, power and all of that. Look at that reduction that has to happen. And so all the conversation here about biomethane is huge. That is a huge portion of it. But we spend all of our time and effort on the things that grab the news, and that's who gets the money. But that's not the biggest impact on it. But carbon removal is still only 10 gigatons, which is not only, is there a need for some level of sequestration? Absolutely. Get back to pre-industrial age volumes of CO2 in the atmosphere, sure. But that can't be the long-term answer. It's kind of where I go with it.
Yeah, and this is super interesting, Jeff, to take it, just one step deeper. We're talking about decarbonizing the grid here specifically, and everybody talks about, electrifying transportation. Fixing food is a really interesting one. And if you look at some data that you published and how these groups have been trending in their emissions, everybody is trending down since 1990. You can see it, except for the agriculture industry's flat. I mean, nothing is happening there. That's a meaningful amount of reduction. I mean, that's 10 gigatons that we plan on by 2050. And what does that plan look like? Is it going to lab-based foods and money going there? And that's less CO2 specific, but I think a theme of our conversation today is going to be, at some point, the consumer is going to have to make a decision. And we've heard it on multiple talks this morning. Well, the perception around biogenic CO2 for the consumer, but the consumer is going to pay one way or another for us to accomplish these goals. I think food is a really interesting one. We talk about nature. Let's start growing more plants, or on the flip side, let's be conscious of what we are eliminating, what we're reducing. So there are some interesting industries in here that may not be tied to CO2, but are the second or third orders will be related to our industry, like the use of biogenic CO2 and that approval, because we're not willing to give up meat, because we're not willing to do the things that get us to that goal of 50 gigaton reduction.
Yeah, and in that you got the ammonia and the fertilizer production and things like that. So yeah, those all feed each other. So the question on this particular question was sequestration versus utilization, and I kind of look at this one for Europe. I'm going to jump over yours here. Here's our sequestration storage capacity. Green's planned, great ideas, needs lots of money. So we're not even close to where we need to be on storage and capacity, let alone all the funding that's going to happen for it. I heard somebody mention the Inflation Reduction Act earlier this morning. In the U.S., that's really driving some of this sequestration, and that's all kind of fallen apart. We had pipelines, we had all these things, but government regulations, permitting. Not in my backyard. I think John mentioned earlier about Germany doesn't even want sequestration whatsoever in their country. There's so many obstacles to it that I think our money is better spent somewhere else. But right now in the U.S., you get $85 a ton to sequester CO2. So if you capture it, we didn't say produce less. We just say capture it and sequester it. You get paid for that. But again, who's paying for that? That is our tax dollars going towards that. And then we'll talk about that in the last question. But I want to jump to this map here really quick. This is the proposed sites throughout Europe of where sequestration is going to exist or does exist. And you really kind of get into here, and I've heard multiple people talk about it, but look at these. You have to get it there somehow. So you either produce these hubs that we talked about a little earlier this morning, where you have a power generation facility that is then capturing that CO2, and you have a hub where you have sequestration right there, where you have existing wells. That's a very regional outlook on these things. And look at you've got all these competing countries that have to come up with those same rules and regulations, and then do that globally. That becomes very difficult. But transporting, whether the pipelines don't exist, you got to build pipelines. A lot of people don't want the pipelines. They do generate their own risks. Or you're driving it. You're transporting it, whether by rail, but you got to liquefy it, transport it by truck, by rail. That takes more energy, adds more cost, and it produces more. So again, I just don't see it as being the most viable option long term.
Yeah, and I think jump back 2 slides, Jeff, if you would. We have to start wrapping our heads around understanding that direct air capture is not going to be that reliable source of CO2 for industry. And some people in the audience may disagree with that. That is my hot take. There is not enough CO2 to be captured to accomplish the goals. We said 10 gigatons of reduction. Even the EU is coming out saying these technologies are just getting started. We're doing 1 ton per day pilot plants, and we're gonna ramp up to the point where we can handle that. Jump one more. This is a graph that shows 100 megatons of CO2 per year. That's 1/100th of the amount required that we're saying we're going to pull out of the atmosphere based on the book that you had just pulled up. And so to rely or to think that in 10 years we're going to be able to use direct air captured CO2 as a reliable source of supply, I don't believe it. I just don't. I think that it has to be sequestered to do the things we're talking about. The incentive isn't going to be there to pull it out and to put it in the alternative use markets. And if you go to your last slide, Jeff, logistically, it doesn't make sense. Everything that's direct air capture is centered around the sequestration points, here in Europe. Putting a pipeline through population-dense areas is going to be a challenge. So if I'm a CO2 supplier and we're talking about new sources today and I'm getting creative, I'm not relying on DAC. I think it has its place. Direct air capture certainly does, and we hope the technologies scale well, and we're rooting for them. But don't put all your eggs in that basket. We have to look to other sources, and great job of messaging by everybody today. Helping to start thinking in that sense.
Yeah, and we're not anti-DAC by any means. I think the answer is all of the above is really what the answer has to be. I just when you're capturing the density of CO2 in the air relative to the density capturing directly off of the exhaust at a production or a power generation facility is it exponentially multiplied. So you're better off capturing it where it's being produced, because that kind of feeds into our next question. Can we eliminate our reliance on fossil fuels? I'll start with this one. The notion that we're going to be off fossil fuels anytime in the next, I like to say 100 years. I just think it's crazy to think that we are going to get there. Now we have a lot of ambitious goals, and we're going to see some of where these goals are, how we're getting there. But we talked about COP28. I mean, this year was really the first year they started talking about carbon capture, and that was the whole talk about it, because the realization is we're not getting anywhere close to the goals that they have set out in the Paris Accord in earlier years. But one of the things for me, and my argument under this one, is let's stop talking about decarbonization. I think that's the wrong way to look at it, because carbon, actually, in the opening segment, it had white CO2 and black CO2, right? There's good CO2. It's a building block for almost everything we do. You take hydrogen and carbon, and you can build anything, produce anything in this world that we need. So it's really not decarbonization. It's defossilization, maybe is the way to say it. Get rid of fossil fuels. I am all for it. I totally understand that. Are we going to do that, quickly? No, but you can scale to that, and we have to get to where we are reliant less on those things. So, talk about the biomethanes and things like that. When we're less reliant on natural gas that we're pulling out of the earth, because we're just capturing our own from landfills or wherever else, then you actually reduce the cost of those products and increase the cost of the fossil fuels, and it will balance itself out. And then that's how we will get off of fossil fuel ultimately.
Yeah, that's great. And guess what? You don't even know this. I threw in a 5th grade level animation for you specifically.
Those are clowns.
I wanted you to be able to understand. So, no, very simply, right? How does this work? Why is fossil fuels, why are they so bad? When we extract the fossil fuels, the CO2 that has been stored away over time from, the process of us absorbing carbon and dying and being buried over, and that starts to come out. And that's what we need to get away from. EU said up till 2027, it's 2021 to 2027, 30% of their budget is going to go to climate-related projects. And so I think simply understanding this graphic and then understanding where biogenic CO2 comes from is important, because it's going to enable the people in this room to make specific asks to ensure that we get a piece of the pie for that budget through 2027. And that's 3 years away. So we're going to have to come back to the table and make sure that people fundamentally understand this. I know that we do, because we live in CO2. It's a very niche market. But we need to make sure that it's not just the direct air capture that's getting funding. It is the upgrading of landfill and using that byproduct of CO2 and actually capturing that and then putting it to work, right? So what is biogenic CO2? Very simply, we've been talking about it all day. I live, I absorb CO2, I die, I re-release it. And over time, we've had the Industrial Revolution and we started extracting CO2. We've grown in population and we've started cutting down trees. We've, grown in how much we eat. And it just, all of these things have taken what occurred naturally and kept CO2 from going into the atmosphere, and has now caused us to send excess CO2. And so we need to focus on getting back to that biogenic CO2 that occurs naturally in nature and do less of the fossil fuels. And we need to make sure that we can incentivize different industries, not just these new shiny technologies.
So I'll take this. This is basically from the same metrics earlier. It's the mapping of how we're doing. And, you don't see a whole lot of green up here. So green's on track. Yellow means more effort needed, and red is not on track. I mean, look at just industry, natural gas supply. Even with everything you talked about today, all the biomethane conversation that we had in this environment is a very isolated environment. We're doing poorly, according to the IAE, or IEA. We are doing poorly in all of this, and even in buildings. So what's in green? Electric vehicles, lighting, solar. So that goes to my notion: getting off of fossil fuels is not going to be easy. We all know this, but we're not getting very far along the way. And so it's about making sure the investments are going to the right places, and which will lead to our last question, but the incentives or the penalties are being put in the right places, because we have to get here. Even biofuels, it's still a microcosm. Everything, all the conversations that we had today, you could walk out of here and think we're doing great. I don't know what the number is. I think it's less than 1% of all fuels today are where we need to be as far as biofuel and things like that. I could be wrong on that number, but it's definitely less than 5% of all fuels going that direction. Sustainable aviation fuel is a great opportunity for utilization of captured CO2. We talked about that earlier. And I think the goal is by 2030 to get about 30% of all aviation fuels use sustainable aviation fuel. So that's still a long way away to get there, but that's where the investment needs to be going. And it has to me personally, I don't think it can't only just be tax burdens or tax credits or inflated costs. There has to be investment there. And we've seen so much investment around direct air capture that really will not generate that much return without the subsidies. You have to have government subsidies to make direct air capture work, because somebody has to pay for it. We should be investing in these things. And so that's the environment we want to kind of get out to and reach to. So yeah, my argument is, to the answer to the question, can we get off of fossil fuels? One day, sure. But I think capturing the CO2 and generating more more biofuels, more energy production. I'm a huge advocate of hydrogen, the hydrogen economy as well. Yes, we have to get to green hydrogen, but steam methane reform with the CO2 exhaust and capturing it to other things is just as good right now. We have to get there, and you can't get there. You have to get there incrementally. You can't just have this monumental shift and just say, oh, we're getting off of fossil fuels by 2030, no more. That's not reality. Anything to add?
Yeah, and then bringing those technologies
Yeah.
to light that are actually using that CO2 and understanding the fundamentals of CO2 and its use case. And this is interesting because a lot of these technologies we talk about, okay, well, you're putting CO2 into a new alternative use market, but it still doesn't eliminate that CO2. I believe we're going to see several sequestration events take place through technology, and that's not just the cement. You see CarbonCure up here, good friends of ours, and that's great, but what they're using is so minute. When you start rolling out the use of CO2 and polymers, I mean, that CO2 is going to be sequestered. Sustainable Aviation Fuel 12 is doing it. There is a lot of use where the CO2 actually will be eliminated for good, or we're replacing what would be the extraction of fossil fuels.
Yeah, we really want to shine a spotlight on some of these companies. These are just some of my favorites anyway, and there's plenty others out there, and they don't get the press and they don't get the investment funding that they need. But like LanzaTech's probably one of the best. They have a biological breakdown process of exhaust, coming off of whatever exhaust, could be power generation, things like that, and it produces carbon, clean carbon that you can then turn into ethanol, and that ethanol is produced into everything that we use. That you scale things like that. That's how you eliminate the reliance on fossil fuels. We're capturing the exhaust off of power generation, off of other sources of it, and turning it back into carbon that goes into plastics and rubbers and polymers and all sort of makeup and all sorts of things. Carbon Free is doing the same type of thing. They ended up with I always forget the name of it. It's PPC, something, I don't know, polycarbonate, something or another. Essentially what goes into baking powder, you can turn that into paints, and that's all sorts of things. So rather than try to eliminate fossil fuel use, and just eliminate things. Let's go to bamboo straws and this and that, like the small incremental things that aren't really having an impact. We can't change the entire way. Human nature is not going to allow us to get rid of plastics and everything. Everything in this room is made from something that started as carbon. So how do you eliminate those things overnight? We're not going to. But these technologies get us there. We get there using the same thing. We don't have to change our behaviors. We change how they're made. And that's the way to do it, in my opinion. More money has to be invested here. Like the CarbonCure gets a lot of the press, and because they started off with the cement curing, which is outstanding. But LanzaTech, Carbon Free, 12, New Light, Carbon Engineering, they're all doing great things, and they're doing direct air capture as well. So I just think there's some great opportunities in all of that.
Yeah, plus, if we switch to bamboo straws, we'd probably have a bamboo shortage at some point.
That's true. Yeah. It does grow fast. I mean, bamboo's good stuff. I don't know why they're straws, but yeah, this is just a summary of here's everything that you can produce with all of these items that are carbon-based, cornerstone building blocks of everything that we do, and look at everything we make from it. So everything we do is from carbon, and so it's not bad. It is not bad at all. Let's use it in a good way. We have an abundance of it. It's a great raw material. Now, ultimately, do we need to be pulling the fossil fuels out of the ground that have been down there for millions of years? No. But we have to invest in these technologies to get there. So that's how we ultimately get off fossil fuels, is my answer to the question.
Yeah, and I'll say one last thing, Jeff, as we go to our next question. Chris noted earlier, these new technologies, they need biogenic CO2 for what they want to do, sustainable aviation fuel, but maybe capturing off of some of the fossil fuel sources is just that bridge gap while we scale up biogenic sources, because we know the infrastructure isn't there. But if the demand for the CO2 is going to be high and the production of CO2 is already high from where we are producing and using fossil fuels, I think there's an opportunity to bridge until we get to the place where we can go full biogenic.
So from just to kind of tie it together to this symposium here, this conference, we've said it many times over the last few years, but where we get our CO2 from, it will not be the same place tomorrow that it is today, that it was yesterday. And we're already talking about that. Chris Carson opened up the day or this morning talking about that. They're already doing it in the UK. They're 5 years ahead of all of us. They're in the rest of the world. In the US, we're so far behind everybody when it comes to carbon capture and utilization technologies. But we have to get it accustomed into our CO2 supply coming from alternative sources, not the sources that we're accustomed to, and that's okay. And the technologies are coming along, and as this the day and a half ahead of us progresses, we'll have more and more conversations about that. But that's really the key that and I see this industry growing because of all of these things. Yes, you can't do liquid CO2 for sustainable aviation fuels and things like that. The volume is absolutely too great, as was noted earlier. But what about all these other things? What if we could capture some of these, turn these carbons, transfer that liquid CO2 into other places? Let's grow our overall market for CO2, use what we already have as opposed to just trying to eliminate it or bury it in the ground. That's my soapbox. All right, last question. Carrots versus sticks. If those were here last year, I kind of spoke to this a little bit. The difference between the U.S. and Europe in general is the U.S. we're all about carrots, and the EU is generally more about the sticks. You have carbon trading, taxes, burdens, all sorts of regulations, and basically it's a cost to produce CO2. Where in the U.S., like I said, we have the Inflation Reduction Act. It pays you $85 a ton to capture the CO2 that you're emitting and find a way to sequester it. And if you can do that, you can just keep producing more of that CO2 because you get paid more. We have a tendency to think really, really ignorantly about that, if I can say so. But that's the difference. But having said that, the question is, which is the right approach? More sticks, more carrots, combination of both? So I'll let you start it.
Yeah, and I do have a bold prediction here on this one. We have kind of fallen into this prediction or thought process in the US that where we get our CO2 from is going to change fundamentally because 25% of it comes out of a dome. And the concept that we are paying $85 to sequester up in the Corn Belt and then down south, we're pulling it out of a dome to put it back into the market, it doesn't make sense. And that one's kind of obvious, and it really only is a matter of time. But it got me to thinking, right? How long until Europe, which we tend to see use more of that stick than that carrot, says we're actually going to place a tax on non-biogenic sources. And so if CO2 here comes from ammonia and urea production, how long until they say, okay, you're going to the market with this, you need to find a new source or we're going to tax it differently. And I believe that is what we're going to see. And that doesn't even play into account, what is taking place with ammonia production presentations you've seen earlier, and where does that go? That's just simply the EU stepping in and saying, we're starting to get aware of different sources of CO2, so you need to change how you're sourcing it, or you're going to pay a tax. That is my big prediction for what is to come in the European market.
Yeah, so I'm going to jump. I haven't heard anybody speak to this one yet today. It's pretty new to me, so I'm certainly not going to pretend to be an expert. This is just my hearing of it, and we heard about it the other day, reading up on it very quickly, but it's very interesting. It's called the CBAM. Is anybody familiar with the CBAM? Look, one
hand. Okay, all right, something new.
Yeah, apparently this is going into, it's already in effect, but basically, Europe is going to, I guess you would say, tax anybody or penalize imports of these particular products here. So your iron, your steel, the fertilizers and things like that, energy. If you're importing that, it's basically a CI score is going to be attributed to wherever that was produced, the country that was produced. So we talked about earlier, during the ammonia production, I think you said 38% of ammonia capacity was offline right now. If I had a guess, I'm guessing that's because of the price of natural gas was too high. I heard negative margin in there. So if you have a negative margin, you stop producing, you go to a lower cost country to produce it, you import it. Well, so in Europe, you have a competitive disadvantage if you're in any of these industries because you can just go take that. We would, in the U.S. we call it offshoring. I guess it's all in the same continent here, or the same realm, so it's not really offshoring here. But you're importing it from Asia or lower cost countries or ones that don't have the level of regulation that you're facing. So you're at a competitive disadvantage at all of these products, which is also why you don't have ammonia production. And I don't think all of the UK doesn't have ammonia production, if I remember correctly, and mostly because of the cost and the regulation to do such. But if you can import it, well, then ultimately, does that get us back to the greenhouse emissions controls that we want globally? The answer is no. We're still using the same amount. We're just shifting it to somewhere else. So this, to me, is Europe saying, we're gonna make everybody else accountable to the same level, or you can't sell your products into our market, and we have a very large market. I kind of correlate it back Rojas. It seems very similar to that. If anybody was in electronics and all of that back in, I think it was like 2008ish, somewhere around there, it was a lot like that. Like you will comply if you want to sell in our environment here, and so that's a big stick. And I kind of like that stick if it's self-funding. The problem is, it's a big stick that makes everybody globally, the cost of every product that's produced by all these things, that much more expensive. So they're estimating up to 35% increase in cost in these products in Europe. So that makes you globally non-competitive as an exporter now. So you can sell to yourselves because you're all under the same thing, but now are you globally at a competitive disadvantage to, say, the U.S. on some of these types of products or products that are made with these types of products, steel and aluminum. I mean, if your steel and aluminum is 30% higher than maybe, say, somebody in the U.S. or Mexico or wherever else in the world, do you lose those export markets? And that's the downside of the sticks if the sticks aren't equal across all the different markets. So that's the one that concerns me in all of that.
Yeah, and then to piggyback on that, I said we come back to the theme of the consumer, right? It's important to understand that the reason for this stick is because we are aiming to accomplish the 90% reduction from 1990 levels. And so there are other ways to do it. Maybe this doesn't get as aggressive, but this is going to be passed on to the consumer. So once again, I can have my soda now with a biogenic source, and we can start to trust the science and the technology that's being put in place that we can all speak to, or I'm going to pay for it in other places. And I believe that education, both to legislation and to the consumer, is going to become increasingly important. And not wrapping now, but at the end, that's kind of going to be my messaging to this group is reach out to others and get them into this room, because we all have to understand that. Otherwise, we are going to pay the price. Because we are ignorant to doing some things that are right in front of us that seem simple to us, but that the general public doesn't understand because we haven't educated them.
Yeah, and so I'll give Rojas his due and the sticks a little bit. There's early pain, right? But the estimation, I can't remember whose estimation it was, but within the European environment, it is about ultimately looking back, it increased the cost by about 5%. The economies of scale, it enforced really development and innovation in some of these markets that maybe didn't happen. So that's a positive for the stick side of it. So, the problem I have though, this is an article in the Wall Street Journal not too long ago. There's a big debate in the U.S. going on if you're paying enough attention, which you have to pay a lot of attention to it. But it's a political hot potato a little bit. But it sounds really great to say. New York City was really pushing this, but get rid of all natural gas appliances in the city of New York. And then they tried to do this throughout all of the industry, and the industry finally did shoot it down because it was just so cost ineffective to do that. But that's our stick in the U.S. So we're just going after the wrong things. We jump on the political bandwagon, what sounds good, and it's something that's tangible. Let's attack the people that you're using natural gas in your home. Is that really relevant? I mean, is it one thing? Sure. Does it have an impact? Sure. But let's go all the way back to, we have a whole long way to go on all these other things. Like, are we natural? Where does natural gas in my stove fit in any of this? It doesn't. And so that's the problem with the sticks. And so that'll feed into where my summary is. So I don't know. I guess to my answer, sticks or incentives or carrots. I think it's a combination. I'm really the incentives in the U.S. right now. The Inflation Reduction Act, it's spurring some innovation, but spurring it in some of the wrong places. Again, some of the direct air capture, it is needed, and we need to do that. But all the money is going to there in sequestration, and we're forgetting about some of these other ones, and we're forgetting about these companies down here who, their whole business model. Most of these people here are not focused on that Inflation Reduction Act and utilization credits. Because right now you get $60 if you capture CO2 in the U.S. and you utilize it in some of these technologies that we've talked about today. You get $60, not the $85. So we're over incentivizing the sequestration and under incentivizing utilization. But none of these people that I'm aware of, or maybe I shouldn't say all of them, but most of them do not. Their business model is not reliant on those subsidies and those credits, because that's not sustainable long term for them. So they're building a business around that. Where do you land on carrots and sticks?
Yeah, no, I would tend to agree that it is a balance. And you've been talking about the $85 for this group, Europe specific. We haven't talked to it's $185 per ton of captured and sequestered CO2 for direct air capture. And that's because the cost to produce a ton of CO2 is so high. But once again, that's what garners media attention in the United States because that's where everybody is playing because it's subsidized. And when you bring up those new users of CO2, to me, they are the most silent, but one of the most important groups for competing interest of CO2. And so I think that, that's going to be a big challenge is making sure that the messaging is right. And so we say, what is the biggest challenge to carbon
I said
neutrality?
3 questions, so this is really a closing. I'll eliminate the question mark here. I'll let you go for yeah. It's not really a question; it's a late statement. And then we'll let everybody go to lunch because I'm sure everybody's ready. So you go first.
Yeah,
what's the biggest challenge to carbon neutrality that faces the world today?
Yeah, absolutely. It's everybody needing a seat at the table. But saying that so that everybody gets aligned, and you go back to the natural gas usage in homes. Did that really turn the needle? Did that really help accomplish the end goal? Well, we have people rowing in different directions, and now here we are once again. All of the users of the existing markets of CO2. Where is the representation of those companies that are the SAF? We've touched on it a little bit today, but those using it for cement and concrete. Where are the direct air capture people? We talked to a few prior to coming, Europe-based, and they said, oh, the CO2 summit, we're going to have to put that on our radar for next year. Fantastic. We need you here. We want you here. Where is legislation? Back in the United States, a CO2 coalition has been formed, led by the Compressed Gas Association, to make sure that they're understanding what their decisions are doing and the implications they have, and where maybe we do need to change incentives or penalties. So everyone needing a seat at the table, not so much that someone is not forgotten, but rather that we're all aligned and we can actually reach these goals that we state. 2050, 90% reduction. That's great to say out loud, but what is the tangible plan to get there? And to me, we're totally missing the mark when we don't come together. I can't think of one event where everybody's represented, even COP28, right? It's kind of the flip side of this is how it feels. And so what is that event that pulls us all together, first domestically or nationally, and then next globally? And I don't think that exists, and I think it is an absolute obstacle to us right now.
Yeah, so when trying to think about that answer and think about the market as a whole, it got me thinking about this. And Luke and I actually attended this conference together, saw this actually happen live. This is a gentleman. His name is Bill Gurley. He's a high-profile tech investor. And it was at the All In Summit back in, I don't remember when it was, July, August, somewhere there last year. But he said, the title of his presentation was 2,851 miles. That is the distance between Silicon Valley, where all the tech innovation happens in the U.S., out in California, to Washington, D.C., where all the regulation happens. And so his whole basis was on that. And one of the most profound statements he said is, regulation is the friend of the incumbent. And you see that, I actually like that CBAM, that one actually seems like it makes some sense. That's some good regulation, where a lot of the other regulations, who drives regulation, especially in the U.S., it's lobbyist groups. It's not politicians saying, this makes sense. It's the incumbents who have the money, who have the leverage, who are putting funding into it. So you end up with these great ideas. By 2050, we must do this. Well, there's no teeth to any of it. And the people that will benefit the most are the people that are already the ones contributing the most to a lot of the carbon emissions of your steel. You think the energy producers are sitting there saying, "Man, let me see how I can clean up my market." Let's. Of course they want to, and it sounds good. And we can talk about all the oil and gas companies globally. All the investments they have in methane and all that, and they're all not doubling down; they're quadrupling down on oil and gas production, especially in the U.S., but globally. We want to send more natural gas to Europe, even though we just said we weren't going to do that anymore. But you really think that if we're not incentivized to do it, the people that are making the money today are the ones that will ultimately write the regulations, which is why we aren't getting there as fast. I do like that, CBAM, because it's penalizing not just people internally, but saying, if you want to sell to our market, you must comply, or you will pay a price. And so that will force activity. But I guess where is this all going to ultimately to the question? And I think that's it. We have to focus on innovation and investment where it makes sense. We have to put the sticks in the right place, but incentivize those that are doing something about it instead of incentivizing people, those that are just kind of greenwashing a lot of these things. That's kind of my biggest takeaway. But so the biggest obstacles are politics, regulation, human nature, and ultimately the money that's behind it. And if we can't bury our head in the sand and don't think those things don't exist, if we really want to get to those 2050 goals, we have to overcome those. And collectively, like you say, everybody's got to start rowing in the same direction. Conferences like this are critically important, as Rob noted on the opening statement. I think the whole theme of this conference this week is exactly that. We're not just talking about CO2 for the food and beverage markets. It's about where else can we use CO2, and biomethanes and things of that nature are critical. But there's other things out there that need our attention, our focus, and this is the industry that can take us there.
Yeah, that's really profound, Jeff. Thanks for that. And to everybody in the audience, as we said, we're just trying to bring stories to light. We are not experts in every single little industry that we talk about by any means, but we get to talk with people. If you are that person, we'd love to have you on the podcast. If you have something meaningful that you want heard by others, seriously, reach out to us. Let's get you on and let's talk about these things. But that's the biggest thing Jeff and I want to do. It's not to sell products today. It's to make sure that everybody is getting heard and that we start to form alignment. It's the best thing for the industry. So thank you all for the time. Enjoy lunch.
Enjoy the rest of the conference.